This is Pokrovsk today, a Ukrainian city destroyed, bombed every day by Russian forces, houses in ruins, empty streets, families fleeing, and this is Putin's tactic. Destroy everything until people have no choice but to abandon their homes. But Pokrovsk is not just any city. This small city is just 20 kilometers from the Donetsk border. If Putin manages to capture Pokrovsk, he can finally say that he controls the entire territory of Donetsk, one of his biggest goals since the beginning of the war. That's why, in the Eastern European summer of this year, Putin gathered 110,000 soldiers. The ambitious plan had everything to be his final offensive. The troops were ready. The weapons were stocked. The commander personally chosen by Putin was confident. Everything seemed perfect, at least on paper. But Putin made a fatal mistake. And Ukraine? Well, they were watching every move. In 48 hours, the biggest Russian offensive of the summer turned to ashes. But how did a smaller force manage to destroy a war machine of 110,000 men before it even began? The answer lies in a mistake so basic that any student of military strategy would know to avoid it. Putin put all his eggs in one basket. To command this gigantic force, Putin personally chose Colonel Ruslan Goryatkin, a man known both for his organizational skills and his absolute brutality. Goryatkin was the kind of commander Putin loved, efficient, ruthless, and dangerously confident in his own superiority. The Russian strategy was simple and brutal. They planned to use the human wave tactic, sending masses of soldiers against the Ukrainian defenses, wave after wave, until the defenders ran out of ammunition, or simply collapsed from exhaustion. It was a strategy of pure attrition, using more soldiers than the enemy has bullets. But Goryatkin thought like a general from the last century. He set up a single command post to control all 110,000 soldiers. A single metallurgical factory near Donetsk became the brain of the entire operation. The commander, his officers, all the important chiefs, everyone in the same place. And the weapons? Goryatkin did something even worse. Practically all the ammunition for the offensive was stored in a single gigantic warehouse in the city of Kharkiv. Thousands of rockets, artillery shells, anti-aircraft missiles, all in one place. It was as if Russia had created two perfect targets and handed them to Ukraine on a silver platter. Meanwhile, on the other side, Ukraine was not sleeping. Their electronic espionage specialists were working day and night. Using tracking technology, they analyzed every radio communication coming out of the Donetsk region. Imagine it like a metal detector, but for radio signals. Every message that Goryatkin sent to his troops left an electronic footprint. And Ukraine was following those footprints. And here's something important I need to say. See, this is the fundamental difference between the two military approaches. Russia was using a more centralized and hierarchical philosophy, something very common in the last century. In other words, they adopt a rigid chain of command where all decisions come from the top. Ukraine, on the other hand, was operating as a modern and flexible network where information flows quickly and decisions can be made at various levels. It didn't take them long to identify where all the orders were coming from. The metallurgical factory. That was where the brain of the Russian operation was. Ukrainian collaborators in the occupied territory confirmed the information. People who still supported Ukraine reported the constant movement of Russian officials going in and out of the building. The target was confirmed, As Goryashkin was getting ready to launch his first attacks, something was about to go very wrong with his plans, but not in the way he imagined. On the night of June 30th, 6 Ukrainian fighter jets took off heading east. This was no ordinary attack. It was an operation that combined the best of Western technology with Ukrainian intelligence. The plan was brilliant. 2 of the 6 planes served as decoys. They dropped special devices called MAUD, small missiles that work as a distraction. Each of these missiles can pretend to be any type of aircraft on Russian radar. A fighter, a bomber, an entire formation of planes. These MAUD devices are true works of art in electronic engineering. They can fly for more than 900 kilometers, perfectly imitating the radar signature of much larger aircraft. It's as if each Mall Day is an electronic actor capable of playing any role in the theater of war. The Russian radars ended up focusing on these fake targets, firing expensive missiles at electronic ghosts. Meanwhile, the other 4 Ukrainian fighters were approaching from the opposite side, flying low to avoid detection. And then they launched the Storm Shadows. These British missiles are impressive weapons. They can fly over 250 kilometers, are practically invisible to radar, and carry a special dual-phase explosive warhead called Brooch. They first pierce, then detonate the target from within. They are specifically designed to destroy bunkers and reinforced structures. The missiles cut through the night sky. It was seconds of tension, and Goryachkin had no idea that his death was flying toward him. The explosion was devastating. Videos started appearing on social media showing the factory in flames. Goryachkin's own command post had been obliterated. But the real impact would only be revealed later. Goryachkin was dead, and most of his officers were too. Intelligence sources reported 8 dead, 9 wounded, and 4 missing. Several subordinate commanders eliminated in a single blow. In a matter of minutes, a force of 110,000 soldiers had lost its leadership. It was like cutting off the head of a giant snake. But Ukraine wasn't finished. 2 days later, the second blow came. On the night of July 2nd, around 10 o'clock, swarms of Ukrainian drones descended on Pokrovsk. This time, it was the Security Service of Ukraine leading the attack. The drones didn't need to carry heavy explosives. The Pokrovsk depot was what the military calls a self-destructing target. The target's own contents would do the job of destruction. Imagine pallets and pallets of highly explosive ammunition stacked in huge warehouses. The drones just needed to hit a few strategic points to start an unstoppable chain reaction. And that's exactly what happened. The first explosions started small but quickly spread. Each explosion detonated more ammunition, which caused more explosions in a devastating cycle that lasted for hours. Local witnesses described the scene as hell on earth. Explosions that lit up the sky and could be seen 20 kilometers away. The ground shook with each detonation. It was as if the earth itself was being torn apart. The destruction was so intense that the explosions could be felt and heard in neighboring areas. Residents reported that their windows shook with each new detonation, creating an endless cycle of terror that lasted through the night. Thousands of rockets, artillery shells, and missile systems were consumed by the flames. But most importantly, the Russian anti-aircraft missiles were also destroyed. Not only the weapons for the offensive, but also the defenses that protected the entire occupied territory. This is what strategists call a cascading effect. The destruction of Kharkiv didn't just affect the battle for Pokrovsk. It degraded the Russian ability to defend the airspace over a vast area of Donetsk. A single well-placed strike had consequences that spread throughout the entire region. In 48 hours, Putin had lost everything. Without orders, without ammunition, without air defenses, the remaining Russian soldiers became easy targets. Without coordinated leadership, without adequate artillery support, they were reduced to making desperate attacks, unsupported. As military analysts described, they became just warm bodies, being sent on suicide missions. But the worst for Putin was yet to come. With the Russian air defenses destroyed, the skies over Donetsk were left open. The Ukrainian Air Force, which previously had to be extremely cautious, could now operate with much more freedom. And they took advantage immediately. They started using French-guided bombs called Hammer. These weapons turn regular bombs into precision munitions that can be launched from 70 kilometers away. The Hammer system is modular. It can be adapted to bombs of different sizes, from 125 kilograms up to 1,000 kilograms. It uses multiple forms of navigation, global positioning system, laser guidance, and even infrared guidance to operate in any weather condition. On June 15th, these weapons had already demonstrated their power. A Ukrainian MiG-29 fighter jet launched 2 Hammer bombs against a position of Russian drone operators in Donetsk, wiping it completely off the map. Now, with Russian air defenses weakened, these attacks have become much more frequent and effective. But Ukraine had an even more impressive ace up its sleeve. Around the same time, it was revealed that they had developed their own glide bombs, essentially copying the technology that Russia had been using, but improving it. These Ukrainian bombs can fly up to 60 kilometers, with plans to extend that range to 80 kilometers in the future. Most importantly, Ukraine is no longer relying solely on weapons supplied by the West. They are building their own. This represents a fundamental strategic transformation. Ukraine is developing its own defense industrial base, ensuring that it can continue fighting even if Western support decreases. It's a demonstration of military maturity and strategic independence. Meanwhile, France announced that it will increase the production of Hammer kits by 40%. Planning to deliver about 1,200 units to Ukraine by the end of 2025. Meanwhile, Putin was trying to save the situation with propaganda. At the end of June, during an economic forum in St. Petersburg, he declared, "All of Ukraine is ours. Wherever the Russian soldier sets foot, it's ours."
First of all, this situation is not the same, it's fundamentally different. And secondly, we are not seeking Ukraine's surrender. We insist on the recognition of the realities that have formed on the ground. I've said many times that I consider the Russian and Ukrainian peoples to be truly one people. In that sense, all of Ukraine is ours, without a doubt, and there are people, and not a few, in the neighboring country who seek to guarantee their sovereignty and independence, so let them have good health. And we, by the way, have never questioned, not for a moment, the Ukrainian people's right to independence and sovereignty. But you know, we have an old saying, not really a proverb or a parable, but an old rule, wherever the foot of a Russian soldier steps, that place is ours.
It sounded like a declaration of strength, but in reality, It was the opposite. It was Putin trying to divert attention from the clear failure of his more limited objectives in Donetsk. When a leader starts promising impossible achievements, it's usually because the possible ones are slipping out of his hands. But little did he know that just a few days later, Ukraine would do something that would completely challenge that statement. Something that may very well have put Putin's grand plans in check. On June 14th, amid the bombastic statements, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made his own announcement. Today,
there was a report today from the Commander-in-Chief, Alexander Syrsky, about the front line, about our active operations. One point that deserves a lot of attention is towards Pokrovsk and our Sumy region, the border areas of our Sumy region. We managed to drive the Russian troops out of there. I thank all our units who achieved this result. Based on the deeds of these days, the warriors of the 22nd and 25th separate assault regiments deserve our special gratitude for their offensive actions in the border region of Sumy and the liberation of Andriivka. In particular, thank you very much, guys.
he is talking about Andriivka, a small village you have probably never heard of, but which may have completely changed Putin's calculations for this war. And now I'm going to explain why. To understand why the liberation of Andriivka is so significant, I need to show you something. Do you remember back in February 2022 when Putin launched his full-scale invasion? One of the first regions he tried to capture was exactly Sumy, and that was no coincidence. Sumy is in northeastern Ukraine, right on the border with Russia. For Putin, controlling this region meant having a direct corridor to Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital. It was part of the plan for a quick and decisive victory. But something unexpected happened. On the first day of the invasion, more precisely on February 24th, 2022 Russian forces entered Sumy. They expected minimal resistance, which was a big mistake. Instead, they encountered Ukrainian paratroopers and armed civilian volunteers who mounted a fierce defense. They not only resisted, but managed to destroy an entire column of Russian tanks in urban combat. To achieve this impressive feat, the Ukrainians used a brilliant tactic that the military calls non-contiguous strongpoint defense. It works more or less like this. While some troops defended the main cities, small groups of guerrillas spread out across the countryside, attacking Russian supply lines. In other words, it's as if they created a military spiderweb that prevented the Russians from organizing. And do you want to know what the result was? In a word, devastating. Putin's forces got stuck in constant ambushes, unable to advance quickly toward Kyiv. And then, in April 2022, just 2 months later, the Russians were completely driven out of Sumy. And here we reach an important point, which completely breaks a very common narrative. Many people believe that Ukraine is only able to face Russia because of Western military support. But the reality is quite different. This historic victory in Sumy happened when Ukraine was fighting mainly with old Soviet-era equipment, basic rifles, and a few anti-tank missiles they had received. The massive Western military support we know today simply didn't exist yet. Now, consider this. Putin believed he could end the entire war in just 3 days. That was literally the Russian plan. 3 days to take Kyiv and force the Ukrainian surrender. But he was completely wrong. The heroic defense of Sumy, along with other resistance across the country, completely destroyed that expectation.
The governor of Sami in northeastern Ukraine reported that the region is free of Russian forces. The announcement was made today, but authorities said the area is still not safe, and according to officials, there are still mined zones where demining work continues. With the withdrawal from Sami, Russia has completed the withdrawal of troops from all of northern Ukraine.
And all of this was purely a Ukrainian achievement, with soldiers and civilian volunteers fighting with courage and tactical intelligence, not counting the advanced weaponry they would receive later. It was only after the world saw this genuine resilience of the Ukrainians that Western countries began to send large-scale military support. The victory in Sumy was not the result of Western support, it was much more than that. It convinced the West to support Ukraine, and that victory had enormous consequences. First, it showed the world that Ukraine could actually fight and win, even when facing a military superpower. Second, keeping Sumy under Ukrainian control was crucial for Ukraine to launch, 2 years later, the famous Kursk offensive invading Russian territory. And you know what? Putin never forgot that humiliation in Sumy. It was then, in 2025, that he decided to try again. Now, I need to introduce you to the heroes of this most recent story from the 125th Separate Assault Regiment. This unit has a fascinating origin. It was created on March 8, 2022, just 2 weeks after the Russian invasion, by local volunteers from Kharkiv who wanted to defend their homeland. In the beginning, it was just a territorial defense battalion, but as they proved their worth in combat, they were promoted. In July 2023, they became an assault battalion of the ground forces. In February 2025, they were expanded into a full regiment. This evolution shows how a unit of civilian volunteers turned into one of Ukraine's most feared forces. The combat record of 225 degrees is impressive. They fought in Kharkiv, survived the hellish battles of Bakhmut, defended Avdiivka, and took part in the Kursk offensive. In May 2024, they even managed to capture one of the most modern Russian tanks, the T-90 and M. Russian television even called them one of Ukraine's most powerful units, equipped with the best Western technology. But it was in June 2025 that they achieved their most significant recent victory. The battle for Andriivka began as yet another Russian attempt to create their buffer zone. A buffer zone is basically a strip of territory that Putin wants to control inside Ukraine to protect Russian border regions from Ukrainian attacks. It's like creating a territorial shield using occupied Ukrainian land. And to achieve this, Putin has concentrated more than 50,000 soldiers on the Sumy border, using small assault group tactics with motorcycles and vehicles to quickly capture border villages. And at that moment, Ukraine suffered a setback. On June 4th, the enemy's tactics worked. Russian forces managed to occupy Andriivka and the neighboring village of Vodolahi. To many observers, it looked like another Russian advance in a war where Russia had been gaining ground slowly but steadily. But little did they know that Ukraine had other plans. It was then that on June 14th, just 10 days after the capture, the 125th Regiment launched a devastating counterattack. They not only retook Andriivka, but did so efficiently that it even surprised military analysts. Zelensky announced the liberation that same day, specifically praising the regiment's offensive actions. But that wasn't the end of the story. Even after the official announcement, there were still Russian soldiers hiding in the village. For a week, 225 Graus was involved in intense urban clearing combat. It was during this phase that one of their assault groups, known as Black Swan, managed to eliminate a Russian commander, Major Andrei Yartsev, at his own command post. Then, on June 22nd, the total liberation of Andriivka was confirmed. The village was completely cleared of Russian forces. Now you might be wondering, why so much importance for a small village that most people have never heard of? Well, the answer lies in its strategic significance. First, Andriivka is just 5 kilometers from the Russian border. Controlling it means controlling one of the access routes to Ukraine. For Putin, this village was a key piece in his plan to create a buffer zone that would protect Russian territory from Ukrainian attacks. Second, capturing and holding Andriivka cost significant Russian military resources. When Ukraine retook it, Putin literally went back to square one, only now in an even worse situation with hundreds more casualties and lost equipment. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the victory in Andriivka forced Russia to withdraw troops from other fronts. Remember the 50,000 soldiers that Putin concentrated in Sumy? They came mainly from Donetsk, and this weakened the Russian offensive in the most important region of the war. The Ukrainian commander-in-chief confirmed that the actions in Kursk and Sumy prevented Russia from relocating 60,000 soldiers to reinforce operations in Donetsk. This means that the small Andriivka is helping to relieve the pressure on the most critical fronts. There's also a crucial psychological aspect to this story. See, for months, the dominant narrative has been that Russia is making steady advances. Small, but steady. The recapture of Andriivka completely breaks this narrative. It shows that Ukraine is not just defending itself, but is still capable of launching successful counterattacks and retaking lost territory. And that's not all. With Andriivka secured, Ukrainian forces are now advancing toward their next objective, Unakivka. This village is about 14 kilometers from Andriivka and only 7 kilometers from the Russian border. It is currently being contested in an active combat gray zone. The commander-in-chief, Syrsky, reported that Ukrainian units advanced between 200 and 700 meters in different parts of the Unakivka area. Brigadier General Ole Apostol, a hero of Ukraine and the newly appointed commander of the Air Assault forces, is leading these operations. What we are seeing in Sumy is a laboratory of modern warfare. Small, highly mobile units, drones, electronic warfare, all in a deadly dance where the ability to adapt quickly determines who wins. And in this game, the 125th Regiment has proven to be exceptional. The liberation of Andriivka may seem small in the context of a continental war, but its impact goes far beyond its geographic importance. It represents Ukraine's ongoing ability to surprise, to fight back, to prove that Putin's grand statements about all of Ukraine being Russian are still just empty words. While Putin speaks arrogantly in St. Petersburg, Ukrainian soldiers were proving meter by meter that the reality on the battlefield is very different from his expansionist dreams. Today, months later, Pokrovsk still holds out. The Great Summer Offensive, which was supposed to be the decisive blow, turned into a lesson in military humility. The story of Pokrovsk shows something fundamental about modern warfare. The strongest force doesn't always prevail. It's the smartest one, the one that can process information faster, adapt better, and strike the enemy's weak points with surgical precision. Putin gathered 110,000 soldiers, but his trusted men made bad decisions. And Ukraine? Well, They used a few dozen missiles and drones, but most importantly, they thought like a 21st century force. In other words, it's a clash between blind pride and smart determination, imperial arrogance against the desperate resistance of a people fighting for their home. And in the end, intelligence defeated brute force, the future defeated the past. And you, what do you think about this change in the way of making war? When intelligence surpasses brute force, are we seeing the future of military conflicts? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this kind of analysis impressed you, share it with someone who needs to understand how war really works today. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how the world is changing. See you in the next video.